Imagine firing a single electron. Not a beam, not many at once, one electron at a time. It travels towards a barrier with two narrow slits and finally reaches the screen. This experiment has existed far more than a century, and yet it still forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Reality does not behave the way objects should. Today I'll explain this experiment from start to finish, using R theory or resonance theory, with no magic, no consciousness tricks, and no vague languages. If electrons were simple particles, each one would go through either the left slit or the right slit. On the screen we would see two clusters, but we don't. Instead, we see an interference pattern, bands of high and low impact probability. Even when electrons are fired one by one. So something spreads, something interferes, yet each electron arrives as a single dot. That combination is the mystery. Saying the electron is both a wave and a particle is not an explanation. It is a label. It tells us what happens mathematically, but not what is physically happening. R theory asks a simpler question. What kind of process can spread, interfere, and still end as a single event? R theory begins with the zero field. The zero field is not empty space, but it's also not a material medium. It is not an ether. The ether was imagined as a substance filling space, defining absolute rest, creating resistance, acting like invisible air. The zero field does none of this. You do not move through it. It does not flow. It does not resist motion. Instead, the zero field is the baseline condition that allows physical relationship to exist at all. It is the quiet background in which phase relations can form. Phase is more fundamental than position. Phase means where something is in a cycle. A clock hand has phase, regardless of where the clock is located. In R theory, space itself emerges from stable phase relationships. So, when we say phase without space, we do not mean space vanishes. We mean phase relationships do not require pre-existing space. Space is a consequence of long-term stable phase locking. The zero field is therefore best thought of a phase domain, not a spatial medium. Now let's make that phase idea feel real. Imagine two identical clocks. Put one here in Amsterdam and one in Tokyo. They are far apart, different places, different rooms, different air. But if you synchronize them perfectly, they still share a relationship. At any moment you can say, they are in step, or one is ahead, or they are half a cycle apart. That relationship is phase. And there is the key insight. The phase relationship exists even if you temporarily ignore space. You do not need to describe the distance between clocks to describe whether they are synchronized. You don't need a physical tube connecting them to define what in step means. Now, scale this up. R theory treats physical reality as built form these kinds of phase relationships. Space is what you get when phase relationships settle into stable geometry that persists. So, the phrase phase without space is not mystical. It's basically saying the logic of synchronization is deeper than the map of locations. An electron is not a tiny solid object. In our theory, an electron is a stable phase structure within the zero field. When an electron is emitted, a coherent phase process is initiated. That process can spread, overlap itself, interfere, because phase can do those things. This is why the electron behaves like a wave, without being a wave in space. The two slits are not decisions. They are boundary conditions. They allow the phase process to continue along two paths, not two electrons, one process, two contributions. Behind the slits, those contributions overlap. Where the phase matches, interaction becomes likely. Where it cancels, interaction becomes unlikely. This creates an interaction landscape. Not bright and dark light, but regions of high and low probability for interaction with the screen. The screen is not passive. This is essential. The screen is a dense, structured field system. Trillions of atoms, electrons bound in lattices, electromagnetic and nuclear interactions, constant microscopic motion. In our theory terms, the screen is a highly resonant environment. It is a full of system ready to couple. And this is the heart of the explanation. Before reaching the screen, the electrons exist as a distributed phase process. It is not localized. It is not a point. When this phase process reaches the screen, something decisive happens. At some locations on the screen, the local atomic configuration, the electromagnetic conditions, and the incoming phase structure match well enough to form a stable coupling. At that moment, the process can no longer remain spread. It locks. This lock is not gradual. It is not a probabilistic hand-waving. It is the physical condition from a distributed phase coherence to localized resonance. This localized resonance is what we call a particle. The particle is not what traveled. The particle is what forms when the process ends. Now we add a powerful intuition. Einstein's message in E is mc squared is not merely energy can become mass. It's maybe deeper. Mass is a way energy behaves when it's trapped, localized, and countable as an object-like thing. In everyday language, if energy is spread out as a traveling pattern, it behaves wave-like. If energy becomes locked into a stable localized configuration, it behaves particle-like. And once it behaves particle-like, it has inertia. It resists being accelerated. It carries momentum in a lump-like way and becomes measurable as mass-like. So, Here is the art theory reading. The moment the electron distributed phase process locks onto the screen, it becomes a localized event. And that is the moment where the relationship energy-mass becomes physically meaningful. Not because a formula magically appears on the wall, but because the process has changed category. Before, a distributed phase process with wave-like propagations. After, a localized, countable interaction that behaves like a particle. In that after state, we can speak about momentum transfers on the screen, recoil, localized energy disposition, and the fact that the interaction is now tied to inertia. That is the intuitive bridge to E is mc squared. In short, E is mc squared is the bookkeeping rule that becomes relevant when energy is packaged into a localized object-like form. And localization is exactly what the screen forces. One caution, to stay honest. This does not claim we have derived all of the relativity from the double-slit experiment. It is a physical interpretation that says particleness is the regime where energy behaves in the mass-like way Einstein quantified. So in resonance language, the mass aspect is not the starting point, it is what emerges at the moment the wave process becomes a localized event. The phase process cannot lock everywhere. Once it locks somewhere, energy is transferred. Coherence collapses elsewhere, the process terminates. This is why one electron produces one dot, never two, never a half dot. Localization is exclusive, not because of observation, but because resonance locking consumes the process. Measuring at the slits introduces an early coupling. The detector forces the phase process to lock prematurely. Once locked, the process loses coherence between paths, cannot interfere with itself. The interference pattern disappears because the process is no longer free to remain distributed. Measurement is not watching. Measurement is force localization. The dot on the screen is not a tiny object arriving, a hidden particle revealing itself. It is the place where the phase process ended, the location of final resonance. Particles are events, not travelers. Put it all together. The zero field allows phase relationships. Phase relationships are like synchronization, like clocks. The electron is a stable phase process. The slit shaped that process. The screen provides dense coupling opportunities. One local location locks the process. A particle appears as a final event, and at that moment, the energy behaves as mass. Intuition becomes relevant, the E is mc squared regime of bookkeeping. Wave-like behavior and particle-like behavior are not contradictory. They are different stages of one process. The double-slit experiment does not tell us that reality is irrational. It tells us that we made a wrong assumption. The reality is built from objects moving in space. Resonance theory suggests something simpler. Reality begins with phase. Objects appear when phase locks. Space emerges from stable relationships. And the particle is not the beginning. It is the ending.